Hi, I'm Surenderjeet Poonian, and I'm here to talk to you about partition. But what is partition? The dictionary's definition is to divide and to separate. In 1947, India was partitioned. Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims were separated. The nation was divided. Following the division of society, the violence, the displacement, and the simmering anger it leaves behind left its mark on people's mental health. And for some, the tumultuous hostility between faiths caused a partitioning of their minds. Finally, we've started to talk about former suicides, drug addiction, poverty, and its connection to mental health. But it's not partition. Why? The typical response of the time was, "We must never talk about this again." That's what mothers said to their children. There were many victims during partition, but also many perpetrators of violence committing heinous crimes in the heat of the moment. They never admit to anyone what they did. Ashamed of what their sons' crimes did, families hid it from themselves, and then they walked away. But when a child sees what should never be seen, when a young mind can't process the information in front of them, and when no one gives them the reasoning they need, what happens to the mind? It partitions. Dissecting evil from good, it quarantines the trauma for safety. But, left alone, unchecked, trauma will seep its way through the cracks of understanding to release itself back onto them at a later date. That's what I call the partitioning of the mind, schizophrenia. And hidden from view, that's what's happening in many war zones today. To stop ourselves making the same mistakes again, we have to reopen the trauma of partition, because sometimes the best way forward is to go back and then take a different path. I'm about to share with you a few stories from those who've lived through partition, taken from the 1947 Partition Archive Organisation website. It's a voluntary community organisation that's recorded many thousands of human stories on their site. Stories that don't come with any solutions, just food for thought and another point of view. Some parts you might find upsetting, especially the last story by Iqbal Bibi, and some have left a message for future generations. That, for me, is the most important part. Agree or disagree with them, you make your own opinions. English is my first language and only language, so if any of my pronunciations in the following are incorrect, then please forgive me. The first story, Mr. Rabi Rakshit. Rabi Rakshit was born in 1937. His house in Tripura was made of tin, and his father passed away when he was a child. Rabi's family were the Zamindars, the revenue collectors of that area, having landed properties and agricultural fields. Rabi says the Muslims were really scared of them. However, there was always communal harmony. Tensions grew at the time of partition. During the riots, it was the Muslims who saved his family, even supplying them with food. Then one day he went to buy fish from the market. He was threatened with taunts to have his last meals within a few days, because after 3 months they were going to start killing the Hindu Bengalis. He couldn't buy the fish, and he came home to tell his mother that he would be leaving the next day for Calcutta. His family were the Debatwa Zamindars, and they had named all the landed properties for the goddess Durga. This meant they couldn't sell off the properties or their agricultural fields, so they had to leave them behind. Rabi thinks that the Bengalis were the worst sufferers during partition. The Bengalis that migrated to Calcutta had to live a life of beggars. Rabi also thinks that partition was not necessary, and that it was all a great mistake. The next extract I will call What Would You Do? Suresh Java was born in District Multan in 1940. He was 7 years old when partition happened. Pre-partition, His household consisted of 15 people, living together as a joint family. It was a big house, 2 floors and multiple rooms, located in the village of Tregar. Suresh's 2 childhood friends at the time were one his cousin and a Muslim boy named Kadeem. There was a small Shiv Mandir in the village, which he sometimes visited with his uncle, and Holi is the only festival he remembers from that time. Suresh recalls the attack on his village. It was the night he was with his grandmother. Suddenly his father barged into the room and took the double bell that hung on the wall. His grandmother held her son's legs and begged him to stop, as she too had heard the news that his uncle had been killed. Agitated, Suresh's father wanted to avenge his brother's death. Stomping out of the house with a gun in one hand and a revolver in the other, Suresh doesn't specifically remember everything that happened on that night. It was only later that he came to know why his first uncle was killed and why his father reacted that way. On the fateful night, March 1947, Suresh's father was asleep when he heard a mob shouting slogans. He sent his servant outside to find out what was happening, and after a while the servant came back shouting and crying. The mob had killed his uncle. Suresh recalls his other uncle calling members of the family to get ready to leave immediately and take refuge in the nearby cluster of houses. The next morning his mother took him to the rooftop and showed him that the house was burning to ashes. He remembers her telling him this: "The mobs have burnt your house." Suresh remembers his father handing him and his brother over to 2 Muslim servants that came to inform him that the forthcoming attack the next night would be much more fierce. His father gave them an address and money to take them to a safe place in case he didn't survive. Later in the afternoon, the Muslim servant came back hugging Mr. Java's father and telling him the army was on its way. The fortunate turn of events happened because following the death of his uncle, Mr. Java's father somehow managed to inform the district administration of the attack. The military was sent as backup, and Suresh is certain that they would have all been killed otherwise. Suresh summarises by saying this: "Had my uncle not been killed that night, our village would have been attacked, our ladies and our sisters would have been molested and butchered. Because my father went with a revolver and a gun to the canal where my uncle was killed and started firing left and right, the mob of 1,500 dispersed. The next day's newspaper headline said this: Chahadral was killed and Char Shimian Sundarjava made the mob run away." After the incidents, his father came and dropped him in Jhansi, Uttar Pradesh, with a maternal aunt, and then his father went back to Multan. Suresh lived in Jhansi and in Bilaspur in the state of Chhattisgarh for 6 months with his mother and siblings. They had lost contact with his father, and his mother had a nervous breakdown. Suresh recalls, "She was not used to living alone in far-off places like this, since there was no communication with my father, and all the time I remember she was confused and irritated because of the mental tension of raising 5 children alone." Mr. Java and his wife now live in Karnal and have 3 daughters, settled with families of their own in Delhi and in the United States of America. Suresh still has 70-year-old photographs of his burnt house which show the magnitude of damage, along with photos of his father and his uncles, the heroes who saved the community from massacre. He feels and states that had the politicians of the time who mattered the most cared for the masses, then the magnitude of losses and sufferings would have been much less. The next piece I will call The Mob. Mr. Charanjeet Singh. Charanjeet Singh was born in 1968 in Jamalpur, Sheikham, Tohand, Tehsil, Haryana. His father, Sardar Singh, was a witness to partition and had told him many stories about it. Sardar Singh was a farmer. In his village, people of different faiths had good relations and celebrated all the festivals together. All aspects of their life, including food and clothing, were simple, and life was beautiful. There was sufficient water for agricultural activities, and farming was commercialized. Sardar Singh was 17 years old when violence broke out in his village. Many families decided to migrate across the border during partition, and many others stayed back, putting their own lives in danger. One night, they gathered together to plan an attack on a group that was planning to migrate. Somehow, the group found out and fled the village, but they were chased down and killed. They also looted the house where they found a woman hiding. She was terrified. Clutching a bag of jewellery, she gave it to them, pleading with them to take the jewellery and leave her alone. One of them took the jewellery, and another forcefully took the woman away. Sardar Singh's family did not migrate and continued to live in the same house they resided in before partition. The last piece I've selected I'll call The Journey. Iqbal Bibi. Iqbal Bibi, nicknamed Bala, was born in 1932 in Quetta, Balochistan. Her father was a contractor for the railways, and she had two sisters and a brother. In 1935, she moved with her family to Jeddah village, Nawanshah district, after the destruction of the 1935 Balochistan earthquake. She recalls a playful and happy childhood with friends, particularly best friend Hamida, who she misses even today. She'd play Pifu Galam with him and play on the swings hanging from the large tree across her home. We made it ourselves, she says. At times she would sit and watch the girls of her village embroidering clothes. There was only one school for boys in Jeddah village, 6 to 7 miles away, where her brother used to go, and no schools for girls in their area. Monsoon season was celebrated with enthusiasm. Young men and boys would play the door and put on dance performances that she'd watch with her friends. In 1945, Iqbal Bibi married one of her elder cousins who used to live in Bufgarf. She was only 13 and he was 23. She was married but continued to live at her parents' house. I was married off to an older man, she says, but felt too young to be a housewife at the time. So I moved in with him in my 20s. Relations between people of different backgrounds in the village were cordial. It was only after partition that everything turned upside down. We were lucky. Families in the neighbouring village were fairly caring towards us. They told us that insurgents were planning to attack our village at 2 in the morning, and that we should vacate the area immediately. After travelling 2 miles, we reached Mehenderpur. At that point, we learned that our village was under attack. Now there was no turning back. There was a glimmer of hope that things might settle down before, but that hope was now gone. From Mehenderpur, Bali and the family went to her husband's house in Gorkhanshah. Sikh families of her husband vowed to travel with them to ensure no harm came their way. They gave us tips for a safe journey. The first journey to Shankar was 12 days long. The Sikh families accompanying us in this journey for the first 11 miles made a statement that we were their kin. At Shankar, about 500 to 600 migrants had gathered together for the journey forward to Lahore. From Shankar, Bala and the family moved towards the bank of the Sutlej and Bias rivers and made camp for the night. They walked for 10 miles and crossed the river in the morning to a sister-in-law's house. They stayed there for 15 to 20 days. From here, they went on to Rahot camp, where they stayed for over 2 weeks. Then they moved on to Banga Tehsil, where another camp for migrants had been set up. They stayed there for another 20 days. Throughout the journey, Bali and the family stayed away from the villagers, moving along the lines of the Sutlej and Bias rivers with the rest of the caravans that were ahead of us. We saw mutilated bodies floating in the river. The scale of bloodshed and violence had spread to the river too. We heard stories of female survivors at the camps we stayed in. There was a woman who'd been stranded. Her people had been murdered and she'd somehow survived. She'd pierced herself with pins to the point of bleeding profusely, and then she hid herself among the dead bodies. We met this woman at the camp, and she'd escaped on her own after the insurgents had done their bidding and left. Bala also remembers the day she saw a man sitting in a tree and shouting. He had gone insane and kept asking the way to the river so that he may drown himself. The man had 7 daughters and 7 sons. All his sons had been slaughtered in front of his eyes, and all his daughters had gone missing. He wouldn't come down from the tree, she recalls. And she saw a woman's corpse on her way too. Her cheeks and breasts had been cut off. The villages that were once full of life were now graveyards and torching grounds for the dead. I feared for my honour and my life. Camouflaging myself in mud and filth to appear ugly or unnoticeable to the insurgents, who were specifically abducting and raping good-looking women from off camps. Bala witnessed people from her husband's village dying of dysentery and cholera. People were hungry and thirsty, drinking water from the wells and eating whatever they could find. There were no doctors in the camps, and about 100 to 200 people had died of waterborne diseases by the time they reached Bahram. My mother-in-law was one of them. Bala and her family were picked up by the military and taken to Amritsar railway station on a fully loaded truck. The journey was 15 days long. At Amritsar station, the truck was attacked by insurgents. Luckily, we were in the hands of the military now, and they'd managed to curb the situation without any bloodshed. We then took the train to Lahore, reaching there a day before Eid. People were getting ready for celebrations, but we'd seen too much human slaughter and bloodshed to celebrate. Bala stayed at a refuge camp in Walton Cantonment, where Jinnah Ant came to visit us in a bus. He met everyone at the camp and said some nice things and then left. Bala's family were eventually allotted 6 acres of land in Dunyampur, Pakistan, by the new government against their property in Nawan Shah. Bala has 4 sons and 3 daughters. Today she lives in Lahore with her husband, sons, daughter-in-laws and grandchildren. Her message to current and future generations is to stay steadfast and to be strong. One needs strength and courage to do the right thing, and you have to work towards that, achieving strength. Otherwise, you'll stay behind and suffer consequences that you'll regret for the rest of your life. Before the division of partition, we were all family, friends and neighbours. Everyone's children were our children too. And that's how we bring ourselves back together. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.